Hello. Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the Trees of the Garden of Eden Part 2. A while back I made a video called the Trees of the Garden of Eden. I didn't call it Part 1 because it was a standalone video. I had no intention of adding anything to it. But as is often the case, after making a video, I'll read the Bible and I'll see things I wish I had added. And it's been about 2 readings. In other words, I've gone through the Bible 2 more times since I made that video, and there's quite a bit that I think we could add to it. I really wasn't going to, but I've seen a lot of stuff out there on my channel and on other channels that I think deserves a response, and this video is going to be that response. First off, I always say that the Bible is not about rules for getting into heaven or anything like the churches present it as. It's simply the written account of the war between God's kingdom and Satan's empire, also known as the war between civilization and creation, or the war between the righteous angels and the wicked angels. But another way of thinking of this is as the war between covenant law and natural law. In other words, we've had to have time to attempt to live by natural law and see if that works. We've had to have time to live by arbitrary laws or legalism, what's called covenant laws, and see if that works. And obviously the laws we're going by right now do not work. So we're going to get an opportunity to spend 1,000 years living under natural law, and then we can think back to what life was like now and make our own decisions as to whether we want to live in that paradise or if we want to come back to the industrial age. Now, something that, and this is going to come up again because when Adam and Eve were created, they were not given arbitrary laws or legalism. They were given natural law. So the law was, to reproduce offspring, be fruitful, to take care of the earth, make sure nothing bad happened to anything on the earth, get plenty of rest, and eat human food. Now, within those natural laws that were put into man were millions and millions of details that aren't recorded in the Bible because they didn't need to be. They were natural laws. If Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, we would know all that without having to read about it. In other words, be fruitful and multiply means reproduce offspring. But obviously there would have been rules about who you could reproduce offspring with. In other words, God would not have approved of humans having sexual relations with other species to produce hybrids, and yet that's what happened. And it's very obvious that when that happened, God was not pleased. The daughters of men had intimate relations with the angels who came to the earth. They produced hybrid offspring called Nephilim, and it caused a lot of problems. So that's just one of the details. God says be fruitful and multiply. Very obvious. He means be fruitful with your own species. Now, the trees of the knowledge, a tree of the knowledge of good and bad, and the tree of life are only in English. In Hebrew, it doesn't specify if the word is plural or singular in either account, but you go by the surrounding text. Well, the surrounding text don't reveal anything. When it talks about the trees or tree of life, we don't know. But it becomes obvious when we get to the book of Revelation. It speaks about the same tree in plural. It calls it the trees of life. So we know very easily from the Greek that it's plural, multiple trees. And so since we also can recognize that those scriptures in Revelation are a direct reference to the scriptures in Genesis, then we can come to the conclusion that the tree of life in Genesis should rightfully be the trees of life. And that opens up another possibility. If the trees of life are plural, then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil could actually be the trees of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the next thing we need to talk about also involves translation. In our English Bibles, it appears as if these two trees are magic. In other words, eating the fruit would alter a human's DNA or something so that they would know the difference between good and evil, or alter their DNA in such a way as to make them live forever. That's why they're trees of life. You bite it, you live forever. And that's the way this story is presented by religion. So, we get that in our head from the time we're very, very small. We spend our whole life believing that, and it's very difficult to believe anything else. But I'm telling you that there's probably more to this than that. The trees of life simply would have been any trees that were beneficial for human life. So it could have been hundreds of species. In my other video, I explained that the top trees of life would have been palm trees, and you can go back and watch that video and see why that's the case. But in the Bible, many different things have names that they gain over the course of their life. You know, Abraham was not born Abraham. He was Abram, which means great father. But God changed his name to Abraham, which means father of a crowd. And many Bible characters over the course of their life will get their names changed. But in the stories about them, they may be referred to by the name that they were given at death, even though at that time they were not called by that name. And I think that's possibly the case with the trees of life and the trees of knowledge of good and bad, that over the course of their existence they gain that reputation. So the tree of the knowledge of good and bad may not have been the tree of knowledge of good and bad when Adam and Eve partook of the fruit. But they became that. In other words, these natural instinctive laws that were put into Adam and Eve would have somehow kept them from eating that fruit, but we have to find out why. As an example, one of the things that would be very obvious is that instinctively humans would not kill. They would not kill anything, you know, plants or animals or anything. So if Adam had been walking through the forest and saw a turtle and said, I wonder what would happen if I take that turtle and hurl it against a rock and kill it. Well, then what would happen is that would have been put in the Bible as the animal of the knowledge of good and bad. And so the religions could spend the next 6,000 years arguing over which species that was and how you should deal with that species and should we eat that species. Just foolish arguments not based on the Bible. So, and that's similar to what's happened here with the trees of life. Now, the way that we can figure things out in the Bible oftentimes is by reading other parts of the Bible. In fact, if you figure something out in the Bible by reading outside information, you know, mythology or secular history or scientific reports, if you can't confirm that in the Bible, then just have to take that it's not true. So a big teaching going around now, it seems to be popping up, is that the tree of the knowledge of good and bad was actually put there by Satan. It was a genetically modified tree. And so, you know, that's similar to our day when, you know, Satan's empire is creating genetically modified foods, which are obviously very, very bad for our health, very bad for the environment. But I don't see any support for that anywhere in the Bible, but there are things that are supported in the Bible. And here's what we're going to do. In the Bible, there are, you know, plenty of these arbitrary or seemingly arbitrary rules called covenant law. Now, the first law given to Adam and Eve was not covenant law, although Adam and Eve demonstrating their ability to break that law would actually make it qualify as a covenant law. Now, the first actual covenant law was between Noah and God, and it was basically the same law given to Adam and Eve, only now they were given a permission to eat meat, which made it extremely different. And then later, Abraham entered the promised land, and God made a covenant with Abraham. And in that covenant, Abraham had to get circumcised. Now, a lot of people argue that Adam got circumcised, and then later Noah got circumcised, but there is nothing in the Bible to support that. And in fact, if you read the Bible, you can see that that actually goes against the teachings of the Bible. These covenants get corrupted more and more and more as we go along, until finally we get to the nation of Israel, and they're given a covenant law with hundreds of rules. And a lot of those rules seem absolutely ridiculous and arbitrary, and the Bible actually supports that this is the case, because God said in many verses, I gave you different laws. I gave you laws that were good laws, and I gave you wicked laws. Laws that you could live by and laws that you could not possibly live by. Not because man was wicked, but because the laws were wicked. And if we look at some of those laws, we can understand some of the things that have happened and will happen, because it was a covenant. That's a two-way agreement. Two ways. So who was in this agreement? God, the nation of Israel. They're in this covenant agreement. So God gives the nation of Israel a bunch of rules. What's God going to do with the rules? If he's requiring the nation of Israel to follow the rules, he has to follow the rules himself. And there are several rules in the Bible that there is not a single instance anywhere in the Bible of mankind being obedient to those rules or breaking those rules. It's almost like they were put there for no reason. But that's not the case. The first one was the law of divorce. You know, it said very specifically that if a man divorces his wife and she remarries, but then divorces her second husband, the first husband cannot take her back. Illegal. And no human ever had that law applied to them. Not through anywhere in the Bible. Not say it didn't happen, but it was never recorded. But Jesus specifically pointed out that that rule was obeyed by God himself, because this covenant is always spoken of as a marriage, and his covenant agreement with Israel was broken when he divorced Israel. Then Israel went off and married the nations. So that meant that Israel could never, ever be married again to Yahweh. And Jesus pointed that out. You know, when the Pharisees tried to act like they were the rulers of the law, God's like, you're not the rulers of anything. You've been divorced. And you remarried. So now you can't come back and remarry Yahweh again. It's over with. Next one. The law of house leprosy. This is one that always, as a young person, always kind of had me raising my eyebrow because it didn't make any sense. Because the word for leprosy that a human can get is the same as the word for leprosy that a house can get. And there is nothing anywhere in the Bible about a man getting leprosy in his house. This is never applied anywhere. But if you look at it, it was obeyed by God himself. God's house. The house he gave to man. This planet, Earth. It says in the law, just like it does with the law of leprosy for a human, or the law of leprosy for clothing, the law of leprosy for a house says, if a house has leprosy, you look at it. And if it has leprosy, you walk away and you give it a week. Give it a week to get healed. And if it don't get healed, then the priest is to come back and look at it. If the house still has leprosy, the high priest has to wash it with water. And then he goes away for another week, and at the end of that week he comes back, and you take all the stones out of the house, and you take them out into the wilderness, and everything that'll burn, you burn. It's the same thing as what's going on with our earth. God gave the earth a full week, after which the high priest looked at it, saw that it wasn't no good, it still had leprosy, and he washed it. That was the flood. Then he gave it another full week, which we're living in right now, and come back and separate all the stones and burn everything that would burn. And we'll get into more what those stones represent later, but just know this, that in every single instance, the stones represent the planets. Well, it's a future video. Please don't ask me any questions about that until I get time to make it. All right, now we're going to talk about the rule, the law, the covenant law that would apply to forbidden fruit. And there is a law in the Bible about forbidden fruit, and it is specifically in reference to the forbidden fruit that Adam and Eve ate from. At Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 23, it says, whenever you enter into a land, that's in the beginning, direct reference back to Adam and Eve, if you plant a tree, you are not allowed to eat the fruit of that tree for 3 years, because it will add to the life of the earth or the tree, or just life in general. On the 4th year, you gather up the fruit and you sacrifice it to God, and on the 5th year, you can eat from the fruit. Now, there's nothing that I can think of that might allow leaving fruit on a tree to add to life, because the tree, a lot of people will actually pick the fruit off the tree the first year before it even starts to ripen, so that the energy can go into growing branches and leaves instead of growing fruit. But I don't think that's what this is about, because that's not included in the scriptures. It actually simply says that leave the fruit on to add to life. Now, if Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden with a tree that was the only tree of that species in the universe, it's only logical to believe that God would have instinctively prohibited them from eating from that tree until it could produce enough seeds and fruit that the fruit could fall on the ground and sprout and create more of those trees. So humans couldn't eat from that. And if they couldn't eat from that, and Adam and Eve knew they couldn't eat from that, it would also explain several other verses in the Bible. But just know this, it probably wasn't a magic tree. It was probably simply a tree that God had set aside in order to produce more of that species of tree. You can't mix the Bible and religion. You've got to get that in your head, that the truth of the Bible and human religion cannot mix. If there's a question about something in the Bible, you have to get the answer from the Bible. If you're looking for truth, you'll never find a religion. And if you're looking for religion, you'll never find the truth. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.